Well, welcome. I'm Dan Hall of the Olympia Paranormal Research Group, and I'm here with my good friend Dave Jinks. Dave, why don't you introduce yourself?
Good to be here, Dan. I'm a fan of the paranormal, just like you are,
Okay.
and author of the book The Monkey and the Tetrahedron, Compelling Connections Between Mars, the UFO Dilemma, and the Future of the Human Race.
Which we had, as I recall, a very compelling discussion on our first episode of Anomalies.
Yes.
So the second episode of Anomalies, we've chosen a little bit different topic, but I suppose all these paranormal topics are somehow related to each other. At least some theorists think that. What we want to talk about tonight is the near-death experience. That has a fascination in and of itself for me, but then because it seems to be somewhat tied to this idea of the afterlife and what happens to you in the afterlife, which could be related to the ghostly phenomena, then that kind of draws me in. Let me just start, and I know you've got some information to share with us, particularly some anecdotes, but let me tell you kind of what prompted my interest in this topic recently and then kind of in the more distant past. In the more distant past, I was present at the time which my mother passed away in 1989 in Boise, Idaho. And a day prior to her passing, she kept telling my dad and my wife at the time that my grandmother, Becky, who was her mother and who essentially raised me while my parents were out working, trying to make a living, was visiting her in the hospital room. And I wondered a whole lot about that. I didn't know. I think I must have asked the nurse about that, and the nurse said something like, "Oh, your mom's very sick, so she might be experiencing some kind of hallucination." But I didn't buy that. I really felt that my grandmother was somehow reaching across whatever void that separates this life from the next life, and she was trying to contact Mom. Then that a couple days later, my mom passed away. So I don't know. That was one thing. As we began to think about doing this second installment of Anomalies, the other thing that I happened to run across was a program on NPR, National Public Radio, about a woman who experienced a near-death event during an operation she had. And and we'll kind of get into this, the idea that there's a lot of reasons, some of which could be easily explained by other things other than paranormal ideas. But one of the things that this woman talked about was during this surgery she was having, she technically died, and her soul, spirit, and there's kind of a controversy, I guess, which term is the best to use when you're talking about this issue, left her body and rose above her body in the operating room and looked down upon the completion of the surgery. And what seemed kind of compelling about this lady's story, and all this stuff was later verified, is that some people could say, "Oh, boy, you're just having a hallucination or whatever," but she talked about the number of people who were in the room at the time, which I guess maybe she could have seen before the operation started, but she described the instruments that were being used and people coming and going from the operating room at the time of her out-of-body experience. And subsequently, when she was brought back to life, she talked to the doctors and the nursing staff that were in the operating room at the time, and evidently she had described accurately what was going on. Now, that to me was kind of difficult to put into a category of, "Oh, well, you just had a hallucination," because it was vivid and verifiable. So those kind of things have drawn me into this topic. Why don't you, I know you've got some information there to share with us about the near-death experiences, things that have kind of drawn you into this topic. So why don't you address some of those things?
Okay, sure. I've got information from the International, let's see, what is it? International Association for Near-Death Studies, or IANDS, IANDS.org. And that group has been around for, I think, 30 years. And they have cataloged literally hundreds, thousands probably, of experiences such as the kind you just described there. And they, have attempted to look at it scientifically, of course, and define exactly what's happening in that case, if something is happening. They try to judge whether it's, as some skeptics claim, it's hallucination, lack of oxygen to the brain is another of the leading skeptical theories. But I think when you look at the evidence, you really realize that there is not a very good explanation that fits neatly into the skeptical scientific paradigm. And that really, in my conclusion is that it is, in fact, an experience that goes beyond what we experience in our regular lives, and it is an actual spiritual experience, for lack of a better term. And so, if you admit that it's a spiritual experience, then that opens the door to all the other things that you spoke about, maybe possibly contacting spirits, of deceased relatives. Now, the question was, you said that your mom had seen
My grandmother.
her mother,
Yeah. 2
And I
days
see.
before she passed away.
and I assume her mother had passed away
Right.
sooner, so
Yeah,
her
several.
mother was deceased.
Right. My grandmother Becky would have been, let's see, she would have been dead 20 years almost
Okay.
by the time this event happened.
Now, did she say what her mother, her purpose was for visiting?
Well,
basically,
and as I
in her
recall
mind, at
that,
least?
in 1989 now has been some 20 years ago itself. I don't recall my mom specifically talking about a purpose other than Grandma was here. I remember two things. Grandma is here to visit, and she wants you, and I think she was talking about my dad and myself and my wife at the time. She wants us to know that everything's going to be okay.
Okay.
That's what I remember about the
So it was a visit that was designed to be comforting, which seems to be very consistent through the various, like I said, hundreds, thousands of reports that are documented by IANs and other researchers in the field. So again, when I guess it might be good for the audience who's kind of, if you're not familiar with this fascinating subject, you might ask, well, what the heck is an NDE,
right.
a near-death experience in the first place? And like so many other things in the field of the paranormal, the controversial science, realm, even that is not clear. The definition is not completely clear on something that sounds like it should be clear. You're either dead or you're not. Well, it's again, this experience, it's the way IANS defines it as a profound psychological event that may occur to a person close to death, or if not near death, in a situation of physical or emotional crisis.
And that could be used to describe what happened to my mom and grandmother.
Right. So, but the most dramatic and really the most interesting cases to me are the ones where there is actual physical death, and those are the ones that are hardest to explain through any skeptical or mundane terms, because in those cases you actually have brain death. You have, in other words, there's no brain activity. There's no, you mentioned chemical, biochemical activity. There's no chemical activity detectable through instruments, at least.
So like you have an EEG flatline.
Yeah, and there's no cardiac, your heart's not beating, your brain's not doing anything detectable, and for all intents and purposes, you have been declared dead. I don't know specifically if there's an accepted time frame that physicians use, but most of these cases, it's a matter of minutes, or some of them a matter of hours, literally, with like a drowning victim, or someone who's died of hypothermia or something like that. And there are cases where those people actually do literally come back to life, and they were literally clinically dead. And those are the really interesting cases. But like I said, the definition of NDE does include some of those other things that we talked about, as far as a profound psychological event. Doesn't need necessarily to be death.
So the group that you're talking about, IANDS, IANS?
Yes.
Now, they have a specific definition for when somebody's dead. They have criteria for what. Because one of the things I was reading about that was somewhat complicating the issue is when are you in fact dead and what constitutes death. If you have a heart attack, that's not necessarily a death event. Cardiac arrest, when your heart stops pumping blood to your body, including your brain, then that's where you get into, are you dead? And then that seemed to be complicated by the fact that resuscitation science, and you were talking about the fact that people could be a drowning victim and their body temperature could be lowered substantially, and they could be brought back to life with those brain functions and heart functions much later than had been the case before. So to me, it's really interesting to get at a definition of death, because if you're going to have a near-death experience, you seem to have to know what you classify as being dead.
Right. And I think that IANS has kind of recognized that difficulty in defining death, so they've included all situations where the reports are similar. And again, that can be someone who is clinically dead.
Which would be cardiac arrest.
Right.
Your heart's not
cardiac arrest is really the definition. If your heart stops for any significant period of time, you can be declared dead. But also interesting about the times when it's possible to have an NDE is the fact that if a person believes they're close to death, that can sometimes trigger an NDE also.
So you wouldn't have to be clinically dead in that case.
No, it can be the same experience can be triggered. Again, it kind of muddies the water too.
Right.
It's not comfortable if you're a scientist used to having real firm guidelines to discuss what the evidence that you're trying to come to a conclusion about, but that's kind of the reality. So again, if you really want to limit it to dead people who have these experiences, that's perfectly fine, because there's a lot of evidence. There's plenty of evidence of just those cases that paints a compelling picture that there really is an experience outside that which we're used to in our regular lives. In other words, it could be a step into the afterlife.
Okay. I guess what I find kind of interesting about that one perspective where you could be close to death and have an experience like this, then the two, or the one really, well, I guess they would be related, so two. The two explanations given that aren't paranormal, one would be a psychological explanation, your ideas about death and your feeling that you could be close to death could almost project your mind into creating a situation like this. Mm-hmm. And because so much of what the mind does is electrochemical, the brain chemistry is the other definition, or the other explanation given for near-death experiences that doesn't take into consideration any type of paranormal aspect. It seems like if you focused on just being close to death, it would be easy if you were a scientist to argue that, well, obviously it's one of those two things, not the fact that you were really dead. When you get to that clinical death marker, it seems harder to argue from a scientific standpoint that it's brain chemistry or some psychological aspect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if you want to be honest with the evidence, you have to do what a group like IANS has done, which is that, okay, we're going to take this experience and look at all the evidence and see if there's a common source for this experience, or if there are different ways to access the experience that comes from clinically dead people who have this experience. So it's kind of a chicken and egg sort of thing, and the skeptical explanations, lack of oxygen, it's the brain dying, it's well, what are some of the other things that the skeptics would say? biochemistry, oxygen. Hallucinations is the other thing, although when you look at the evidence, again, these reports are of crystal clear recollection. They're of opening, widening clarity of views on the universe. They're not at all like a typical hallucination in a clinical sense, where hallucinations are usually feverish, confused, really foggy experiences, memories of things. They're not usually, visually rich and memorable and mind expanding. And those are all the terms that people use when they have an NDE. So that the characteristics of this experience seem to be a lot different from just a hallucination as we know it. So that's not a very good explanation, and I think that the skeptical side has kind of shied away from the hallucination. Obviously, the other sort of knee-jerk response is drugs. Guy must have been on drugs. It was a result of the drugs, which of course goes into the brain chemistry thing. But again, drugs don't typically create
clarity,
memorable. It's more, foggy, confused, easily forgotten, transient sort of visions of things, and that's really the opposite of what the experiencers report.
So, as I reflect upon what happened with my mom and grandmother, it actually would be more conceivable that there could have been a psychological, neuro-brain chemistry explanation for that event, rather than my grandmother actually visiting my mom, because my mom was very ill. She was taking certain kind of drugs for pain management. Her faculties were compromised because of her state of illness. But yeah, you're right, though. Some of those others, as I referred to that NPR article and some of the things you're talking about, when you have such moments of clarity that are highly descriptive, and it just makes it more difficult to argue that there's not something there. And when you said initially, you kind of mentioned the fact that some of these questions deal more with spirituality. I found myself chuckling a little bit, because the minute you get into spirituality, science is going to be compromised, because you're going to try to prove things that there won't be proof for, and maybe that's a part of what we're talking about here. Did you have some anecdotes, or did you want to talk a little bit more about some of the definitional aspects of
one of the things, the thing we should cover is the feature of a typical NDE, although they can, again, the Hollywood version is that the experiencer goes through a dark tunnel towards the light. At the end of the tunnel, maybe meets deceased relatives and possibly a religious figure. Though when you look at the body of evidence researchers have compiled over the last 30 years or so, the tunnel in particular is actually quite rare, as far as I understand. Maybe 10% of experiences have a tunnel. But there are about 15 characteristics that really kind of summarize all of the experiences together. And IANS lists these as, again, the tunnel, encounters with spiritual beings or religious figures, encounters with deceased loved ones, perceiving a spiritual realm, experiencing a great light or darkness, heightened perceptions, which is kind of general, but it falls in the category that we were talking about. Typically, it's a very vivid, memorable, and clear. Most experiencers describe the NDE as more coherent than reality, more clear than anything they've experienced in their life, which again is really not anything like we know about
drug-induced states, coma,
hallucinations,
semi-comatose states,
lack of oxygen to the brain. none of those has really any chance of creating the experience that's commonly reported of ultra clarity, heightened perception, vividly memorable landscapes. And this is my favorite, a life review.
Right,
I hear that a lot, and that really opens up a whole bunch of other questions about, if this is a genuine experience, if it's a step into the afterlife, why would you have a life review? And again, that's where morality and the meaning of life, purpose of life, a bigger purpose, all those sorts of profound questions come into play. But that a life review seems to be a common characteristic. Of course, you have a sense of oneness, interconnectedness with the universe. Some people have a sense of having knowledge of the future. They receive messages from the light beings or the religious figures or even the deceased relatives that they meet. And in fact, I've read a few cases where the person met was not deceased yet.
Oh.
So there are reports of that type of encounter. And another interesting feature is a border of no return. And that seems to be a very common report.
That's one thing I was going to refer to when you were talking about the white light. I too have read about this border, and the border could appear in several forms, like it could appear to be a river, could be it's something kind of threshold. And oftentimes, from what my reading has given me, when people approach this border, if they encounter the beings of light or if they encounter the deceased relatives, before they get to the point where they're going to cross that border, there's some kind of interchange of information as it's your time to cross over to the other side, or it's not your time to cross over to the other side. And so once you cross that border, it seems like it's more likely to be a permanent death kind of an experience and a near-death experience. Is that what you picked up on in your reading?
That's what the reports tend to indicate, that it's either it's a guide who says it's not your time, which is the more possibly religious version of that experience. God is telling you, no, it's not your time. But in a lot of cases, it's the being, whoever you're interacting with, saying that you have a choice. Do you want to stay or do you want to go? Come with me, or stay in your life. And again, the reading over the reports, it's extremely tempting to go. Most people say, I really wanted to go, but I knew I had to stay in this life.
Something was unfinished.
Yeah, I hadn't fulfilled my purpose. So again, those are kind of the group of, admittedly, cover a lot of different experiences, but those are the characteristics that you see reported in these near-death experiences. And I thought maybe I'd just go over a few cases here. I'll just read. This is again from the IANS.
Well, before you do that, I have a question about the piece on NPR, and that you might want to address, because the piece that I was listening to on NPR was characterized as a near-death experience, but might also have been characterized as an out-of-body experience. And in your reading of the different criteria for a near-death experience, I don't think I heard anything that sounded like an out-of-body experience. So would the IANS folks exclude that? Is that more like an astral projection? I don't know. Did they address that in there?
My understanding, or my take on that, is that they are similar, and I don't know that there's a very easy way to distinguish between them. In the out-of-body, we tend to think of this, again, like you said, astral travel, maybe travel to a different plane or at least a different place. I think the near-death experience is typically, I don't even know if I can say that. I was going to say they typically stay in the hospital room or the area where, but you do see reports of people, all of a sudden I was in a field, the most beautiful wheat field I've ever been in, and it was a vivid landscape, and I've heard cases of the crystal cities, that sort of thing. So I think the only difference between the NDE and the OBE would be that the NDE is more closely associated with
cardiac arrest.
A death experience.
Okay.
Or a highly traumatic psychological experience where there was the possibility of death.
Okay.
You see cases, unfortunately, where a child abuse victim, or a case where it's a genuine threat to life. The OBEs, I think, I'm not as familiar with what a typical OBE is, but you tend to think of them as maybe during sleep or something, where you come out of your bed and it's not necessarily in relation to any specific event. It's just all of a sudden I was out of my body. So, maybe that's the best distinguishing factor between those two things. Although I would think they must be related somehow. Of course, a skeptic would say, of course they're related. They're all hallucinations.
Right. The typical skeptical response to that.
But again, I think it's good to be a skeptic, and you also have to look at all the evidence. You can't just pick and choose the evidence that goes both ways, of course. But for example, this is the case of Pam Reynolds, again from the IANS.org site, and this is one of the most famous cases. In order to remove a life-threatening aneurysm deep in her brain, Pam Reynolds underwent a rare surgical procedure called Operation Standstill. The blood was drained from her body like oil from a car, stopping all brain, heart, and organ activity. During this procedure, the body temperature is lowered to 60 degrees, and while fully anesthetized with sound-emitting earplugs, Pam's ordeal began. Her surgeon was Dr. Spetzler. He was sawing into her skull when Pam suddenly heard the saw and began to observe the surgical procedure from a vantage point over his shoulder. She also heard what the nurses said to the doctors. Upon returning to consciousness, she was able to accurately describe the unique surgical instrument used and report the statements made by the nurses. So, in that case, with her body temperature lowered to 60 degrees, she was basically as dead as you can get. No brain activity. Her heart was stopped. No organ activity. And so the skeptical question you would ask to the skeptics is, how can you possibly have any perception of anything in that state, unless there's something we don't know about how the brain and the body works, or there's maybe another realm in which the body can ascend to, or the brain or the soul, the spirit, whatever you want to call it. So that's a good question for the skeptics, and I haven't heard a skeptical response to that. I don't know. Have you heard a response?
In the NPR piece that I was talking about earlier, the person who was being interviewed was a physician, and he had done extensive studies, somewhat similar to Ian's. His comment, though, about how death occurs in terms of how it affects the body leads me to kind of a conclusion that skeptics wouldn't accept. And he said, essentially, it's like if you thought about your body as a computer, if you unplugged your computer and the system just went dead, that's what death is all about. So from a skeptical standpoint, how could you then have a hallucination? How could you then have some psychological reaction to the thought of dying or the experience of dying when there's essentially no electricity, no one's home, the lights have been turned off? That seems to be something that would be very difficult for a skeptic to challenge in terms of more rational explanations. The interesting part of this anecdote and some others, though, is that notion of, well, if our consciousness ceases to exist at the minute of death, and then it is then reintroduced or I guess you'd have to say reintroduced based on this idea that once the plug is pulled, there's nothing there. If it's reintroduced later through some kind of resuscitation science intervention, then where did it go in the interim? And then that leads to a whole bunch of questions about the afterlife, some of the things that, I've investigated through the Olympia Paranormal Research Group, ghostly activity, hauntings. So when you clinically die, and then you're resuscitated in your personality and your spirit or your soul or whatever you want to call that, some doctors probably would, I've heard them refer to it as the psyche rather than the soul, because it seems a little bit more clinical. What happens to that essence of us during the time that our essence isn't within our physical body due to a death state?
Well, that's a question that's been asked for literally thousands of years, I think. And if you take thousands of years of human existence into account, what the NDE researchers are showing, I think, is more consistent with what cultures have believed through the millennia, and that is that the human body is more than just a physical thing like a computer, like you said. And once it's unplugged, it's done, and the consciousness goes out like a flame being blown out. I think the flame exists and persists all the time, and when your physical body is, again, to use that analogy, when it's unplugged, your flame stays lit. It's just not in your body anymore. And of course, that's a profound question that is who knows if it will ever be answered. But that is the question, of course. So let's talk about another specific case that I find pretty fascinating. I'm sure anybody would. This is Maria's shoe, and it's a report by Kimberly Clark Sharp. It's from 1995. She was a social worker in Harborview Hospital up in Seattle, just an hour away from us. And Maria is the patient who had the near-death experience. She was brought in unconscious from cardiac arrest. Sharp, again, as a social worker, she visited Maria the following day in a hospital room, at which point Maria described leaving her body and floating above the hospital. Desperate to prove that she had in fact left her body and was not crazy, she described seeing a warm, dark blue tennis shoe on the ledge outside a window on the far side of the hospital. Kimberly Sharp didn't believe Maria, but wanting to help, she went across the hospital and she checked the ledge by pressing her face against the sealed windows, and she found a shoe that perfectly matched the details Maria had related. So again, this doesn't talk about specifically how the operating room, the exam room, the hospital room situation, but it was clear that Maria, by the definition we gave earlier, cardiac arrest, her heart had stopped and she was dead, clinically. So the question is, how could she have possibly, even if she, even if she was alive, how did she know about the shoe?
Well, is that, Dave, do you think, is that the real central question in these near-death experiences? Is the why important? I mean, or maybe is the how important? Like, how did she know that? But she did know that. And the social worker was able to verify that her assessment was accurate. Maybe it may be difficult to ever prove the why of near-death experiences, because that may be cultural. The answer to that might be cultural. It could lie in our versions of spirituality, but it seems like it's fairly easy to corroborate that people have sentient experiences during times when they're supposedly don't even have a consciousness. So what do you think? Is it more important to ask the how question about near-death experience, or to accept the fact that there's a lot of evidence that says that this kind of phenomenon goes on?
Well, I think it depends on, what your what your beliefs are already. You and I, we feel, and I believe properly, skeptically, scientifically, that the reports, hundreds, again, like I said, hundreds of thousands of reports, are genuine. There's no reason for people to be making things up. And, that is enough for me to take that next step and say, okay, sure, it's happening. But the next question is, why is it happening? What is behind it? You don't stop at that point. In my opinion, you don't stop at that point and say, well, it happens. Naturally you want to know, what does it all mean? And of course, if you're still on the skeptical side, you're not willing to get to that point yet. So you never do ask why. You're just busy explaining how it can't be true.
Well, see, I'm wondering that even if you're not skeptical, there's maybe a cultural reason about how. I mean, if you look at certain religious traditions that might believe in an afterlife that involves heaven, some of those traditions say that people don't directly go to a higher place, heaven, or a lower place, hell. They're kept in some kind of stasis, some intermediate place before that transition takes place. So that could be an answer of how something happens, or maybe, once again, mixing how and why. But could be a further explanation beyond, well, the fact that you're dead. It explains where your spirit goes for a certain amount of time, and then if you're resuscitated, then the question of whether you go to heaven or hell, if you believe in that, is kind of a moot point. So I guess I'm saying is there's always maybe an answer to, as somebody could supply an answer based on their cultural beliefs or their religious beliefs about how this experience transpired. But I think it's just significant, and again, maybe for further inquiry, to validate that enough people have this experience to say it's a real experience.
Yeah, one of the other things that is pretty striking about the reports is that there doesn't seem to be a correlation between religious beliefs and the likelihood or depth of an NDE. So they happen across all cultures, and there's no correlation between age, race, sexual orientation, economic status. In other words, it seems to be a human experience, regardless of where you are in the hierarchy as determined by your those various characteristics. And although definitely there is a difference depending on your belief system, when you during an NDE encounter a religious figure, typically it's the figure that you expect to see, depending on your heritage or your religious beliefs.
Muslims will see Muhammad or some other religious figure that corresponds to their particular, or Allah, that corresponds to their theology. Mm-hmm. So have there been studies which would say that someone who has a near-death experience who is more religious, likely to see a religious figure? Is there a correlation between that? Did you pick up on any of that in your reading?
More likely, they're not more likely to have an NDE, but more likely to have the encounter, you mean?
Right, with a religious figure, if they're a religious person, as opposed to an atheist.
I think probably there is. I don't have any, I can't cite any specific statistics, but even an atheist will have that spiritual presence felt, which is pretty interesting, because you would think, although the atheist probably isn't going to come back and say, I saw Jesus, but they may say, I saw God. Mm-hmm. So it seems across the spectrum that people still have that religious, spiritual experience, but they may call it different things, but
based on their belief system.
Yeah, but they still have the profound spiritual, religious, I should say spiritual experience.
Well, and now this may be a part of what you're talking about, might be just a nuance, but the other thing I don't know that I heard specifically mentioned, but you could be referring to it, is one of the other components of near-death experiences is for those people who have them, it transforms their life. They have no fear of death anymore. I don't want to get into the situation of saying, well, they become a more spiritual being or they become religious if they weren't religious. But have you encountered, and maybe that's what you're referring to a minute ago, have you encountered this notion that these people really do have a transformative life after that, even to the extent that I've heard of some people developing psychic powers that they had not had prior to the near-death experience?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the most consistent features of a post-NDE person, human, and that's that they, again, they feel a stronger connection to humanity as a whole. It's one study here that, again, that IANS has on their site, that over 80% of the surveyed near-death experiences expressed a strong increase in their concern for others and that life has meaning or purpose. So they come back feeling like they have a stronger connection to life. Now, if you look at the individual reports, it's definitely more. People don't come back. Well, people do different things with that feeling. Some people may become even more involved in their church. Others may just feel a bigger connection, and they do social work or join the Peace Corps or something like that. But again, it's shaped, I think, by the individual's prior belief system as far as their spirituality or their involvement in religion. But they certainly feel a deeper tie to the rest of humanity, the rest of existence. So that, again, that's a huge percentage of them. And again, according to IANS, 55 to 89%. I'm not sure where they come up with those numbers, but it's clearly a majority of the NDE experiences report an increase in psychic phenomena or healing abilities following the NDE. Obviously, that's it's controversial. How do you measure those things? Is it just the person believes that they're more psychic because they have a stronger connective feeling with the rest of humanity?
Although I would say that most of the people I know who would characterize themselves as psychics or intuitives or whatever word they want to use, they talk about the ability to tap into the other side. And those abilities seem to be innate. So maybe what the near-death experience is just kind of a tool, a passageway for those people that aren't necessarily born with these very sensitive, intuitive feelings to tap into that, because they have literally been to the other side or close to the other side.
Yeah, and some huge number, I think it's 95%, 90+% of people in their reports say that they no longer fear death.
Right.
And that in itself is really hard to explain. Again, if you're a skeptic, I almost died, or I died, therefore I'm not scared of death anymore. I don't know that makes sense in a biochemistry view, or hallucination view. However, if you know that there is an afterlife, that you're not just going to be snuffed out like a candle blown out or a computer being unplugged, if you know there's an afterlife, it makes it a lot more interesting, for one thing, but it makes it a lot less scary if you know you've got something to continue with. And again, most of the experiences are highly positive.
Well, yeah, that's where I was going to go, because in the little conversation we had before we started this episode of Anomalies, we were talking about, has anybody ever had a near-death experience that didn't involve a positive spiritual being or a white light? Is there a near-death experience that involves, rather than touching upon heaven, touching upon hell?
Well, as far as the evidence shows, and that I'm familiar with, yes, people do have it's a smaller percentage. It varies quite a bit as far as the group reporting, but it's something like 3 to 17% or so. So, like 1 out of every 30 to 1 out of almost every 5 would be considered either a negative or a neutral experience. So it's not all tunnels of light and warm embraces with the Creator, those sorts of things. It's not always like that, although I've heard. I was just reading before the interview that at a group of the near-death experiencers, the discussion was of exactly one of these hellish experiences, and the person describing it said, "This happened to me, and this happened to me, and it was horrible." And then somebody in the audience said, "Oh, I had that same set of experiences, and I found it enlightening, although it wasn't
negative.
It wasn't
negative,
necessarily
but
pleasant, but it was enlightening to me. I came out of it, with feeling like I had learned something." So, you can argue that the so-called negative experiences are just very confusing and unwanted, maybe, and shocking, and the response is, that was very negative for me. So again, it depends maybe on your perception going in. Sometimes I think of what would it be like if I had a near-death experience, because I know what I'm expecting if I ever get hit by a car or struck by lightning or something. I think I know how I would react, and I think it would be a good experience based on what I've read. But if it's not, for some reason, if it's not what I'm expecting, then of course it could end up being negative and shocking and unpleasant.
Yeah, and I think your characterization of what does exactly mean to be negative or unpleasant is really specific. You probably remember several years back, Art Bell, one of our iconic radio broadcasters on Coast to Coast AM, claimed to have some recorded sounds from hell. And so you would wonder, if somebody's having a negative near-death experience, what that would be like. Would you see versions of your version of hell, or if you're a religious person, see that version of hell, or would it just be an unpleasant life experience that you wouldn't want to have to undergo? And then if you did have that negative experience, we said that one of the things about the positive near-death experiences is that people no longer fear death. Would you then develop a fear of death because you wouldn't want to be exposed to this more negative environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. It really kind of shows you that it's very possible that your afterlife, if there is one, may be shaped by your life here. You may carry your personality and your belief systems even into the afterlife, which, could be a scary prospect. You're hoping to become a much purer, more knowledgeable being beyond, and if you're stuck if you don't like yourself, maybe, if you don't like your personality in this life, you have to continue being that person in the next. So, it's a springboard for lots of really, really interesting questions beyond.
Well, one of the things that keeps coming to mind as someone who's done paranormal investigations is the relationship between near-death experience and what we would call a ghost, although there's a lot of, or there's a huge lack of uniformity as to what exactly is a ghost. But one of the definitions of a ghost is the essence or spirit of a departed being. Mm-hmm. So I wonder to what extent, and I haven't heard too much about this, but to kind of meld those two fields, the near-death experience and the ghost investigation phenomena together, to see if you could come up with a more concrete idea about what happens. In other words, while this person, I was thinking about the person that you described who was having the out-of-body experience. And of course, this wouldn't happen because people aren't expecting a near-death experience, or are they necessarily anticipating a ghost type of phenomenon, unless it's associated with death. You're thinking about death, but you're not clinically dead. But somehow, if in an operating room you have paranormal investigators trying to detect the evidence of a ghost after the fact that someone is clinically dead, if that would somehow lead to any more validation or verification of the near-death experience, or I don't know, there probably would be ethical issues about putting ghost hunters in an operating room type of thing. But I'm just wondering, it seems like those two things kind of go together, because we always think of ghosts as being the essence of some departed spirits. Now, why they're departed, I mean, that's subject to question. So what do you think of that?
Well, I have to admit that ghosts kind of baffle me, because it's really hard to see where they fit into the whole, because they seem like they're interlopers, if that's correct. They're in between, they're tweeners, they can't decide where they should be. And is that really, it's the ghost's nature to be in between life and death, maybe, or is it our perception of that particular spirit? So it's a chicken and egg thing. It's like, do we see ghosts because of something in us that generates the ghostly image, or is the ghost a separate entity that is intruding at least sometime in our reality?
But if you,
I can't figure that out.
Well, and a lot of the stuff that
can?
a lot of the stuff we talk about, I don't know that people can figure out. But it just seems intriguing to me that if and we'll call it the spirit for lack of some other, you could use the soul, I guess, as a synonym for it. But if a spirit leaves a physical body and then can return to that physical body, that and we're not talking about once a person dies, someone going directly to heaven or hell. And of course, those are religious concepts which not everybody believes in. That if you've got a spirit loose outside their body, that somewhat meets the definition of a ghost. So it seems like those two things should be, looking at those two things, should be related somehow.
Yeah, I would think that they're somehow connected. And that brings a pretty interesting point. I see we're getting close to the end of the hour, but I know I just heard an interview with Dr. Raymond Moody, who is one of probably the pioneer as far as popularizing, although there's several other major players, but he has written several books, and he's brought this to the attention of lots and lots of us, this subject at least. And I was listening to an interview with him a month or two ago, and he said that there have been some pretty extraordinary developments in the NDE research field. And what made me think of that was you talked about having a paranormal group maybe in a hospital room doing research or whatever. Yes, you're right. It'd be tough to get the family's permission probably to do something like that. But what he reported is that there has been a growing body of evidence showing that at the time where the patient experiences an NDE or is reaching the end of life period, that people associated in the room, family members and including even the doctors, have reported more and more frequently seeing the same visions or having the same experiences as the dying person or the dead person. And he seemed to say that it's very, very significant. Now, I don't know if it's just people are more willing to report those things, or if it's kind of an uptick in the activity, intensification of the experience itself. But that, to me, would be a pretty rock-solid bit of evidence that this is not a phenomenon that resides totally in the experiencer's mind, of course. If you're bleeding out into other people's reality, you pretty much have to admit there's something real, for lack of a better term, going on.
Yeah, I would think that would be a very interesting intersection of events that might be a clue to some broader question.
And when like all things scientific, it seems that you kind of go full circle back to the original belief system of ancient cultures, because there still are, but there, historically has been a shared belief system in some of the things that we call superstitious or spiritual religious activities. And I think that it was once common in certain groups to have shared experiences at death, as a time of transition where it wasn't just how we do it today. You leave the guy or girl to die, the old person to die in the room alone. The doctor leaves the room and it's the end of life, and it's, that's it. There's no ceremony or anything to go along with it these days. It seems to be a very sort of cold, sterile sort of, transition that we've kind of allowed to happen in at least in American society, modern society. Especially if you don't have family, to let that person die and make that what could possibly be an extraordinary, glorious transition. If you really are moving into a different life, different universe, to just let somebody die alone without sharing that experience seems to me to be pretty anomalous when you compare us to past cultures who went to such great lengths to celebrate the end of this existence.
It was really, and I think of it about a lot of things in sociological terms, but that really, some of those other cultural experiences were really a rite of passage, because it was a ceremony that involved transitioning from one life state to a non-life state, and here it's so clinical in modern society. Well, one of the things that we had talked about doing here as we wrap up this episode of Anomalies is inviting those of you who are brave enough and interested enough to listen to our podcast, who have had what you would consider to be a near-death experience in any of the different facets that Dave talked about with the Iron Group, to contact us to let us talk with you here about your stories, and we would be very respectful of confidentiality and other issues such as that. So if you feel a need to contact us, you can do that through the Olympia Paranormal Research Group website. Our web address is olyparanormal.org. So you can send an email to me, Dan Hall, at olyparanormal.org, and I can forward that on to Dave if you'd like to tell us something about your near-death experience. Well, Dave, another fascinating topic. Sometimes these topics are not necessarily, they don't come with all the answers that you might like, but they certainly come with a lot of interesting questions. So I appreciate the opportunity to get together with you and talk about this.
Well, I appreciate it too, Dan. We'll do it again soon.
Okay, maybe next time we'll go into the forests of the Northwest and look for hairy bipeds or something like that.
Sounds fun.
Okay, all right. So this is goodbye for now from Anomalies, a program about the edges of the unseen and what might be.